Marhaba, welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan. We welcome you to the Palestine teach-in on the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is the third in a series of teach-ins about Palestine hosted by the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And at this point in time, December 5th, 2023, more than 17,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by the Israeli military. More than 5,000 are missing under the rubble of residential buildings and presumed to be dead. And over 40,000 Palestinian civilians have been injured, all in a context where they are trapped in a 25-mile by 5-mile strip of land that has been blockaded for over 15 years by Israel, and they have nowhere to flee the Israeli military assault that is occurring in the north, central, and south Gaza. As a result of the atrocities committed by the Israeli military, there are numerous scholars across the world who has expertise in genocide who have concluded that we are witnessing an unfolding genocide and ethnic cleansing. So for those very dark reasons, those very tragic reasons, it's never been more important to understand the history of Palestine and the history that got us to October 7th. And our first teach-in was on Gaza. Our second teach-in was on Palestine 101, and our third teach-in today is on the West Bank and Jerusalem. All of our teach-ins can be viewed on the Center for Security, Race, and Rights YouTube channel, so I encourage you to subscribe. You can also follow our work on social media at Rutgers CSRR in Instagram and RUCSRR on Twitter and Facebook. And also follow our newsletter, join our newsletter at csrr.rutgers.edu. My name is Sahar Aziz. I am a distinguished law professor at Rutgers University. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, including the international events or international relations between the United States and Muslim majority countries and Muslim people across the world and Arab people across the world. So Palestine fits squarely within our transnational rights and security theme or mission of the organization. And before I introduce our guest, Dr. Zachary Foster, who will be delivering the teach-in, I want to encourage everybody who benefits from CSRR's work, who finds it informative, who finds the information that we share, the expertise that we bring, helpful to your understanding of Muslim, Arab, South Asian communities, of regional and international politics affecting Muslim majority countries and Arab countries, to please donate to CSRR. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and give generously. It is your donations that allow us to continue this work and to provide it free of charge. And it goes without saying that in the United States of America, in particular, there is a very strong opposition and hostility and desire to censor any perspectives that provide the Palestinian experience, that give a platform to Palestinian voices. And so it's never been more important than now to make sure that we offer these perspectives to balance out what tends to be the dominantly Israeli government's perspective when it comes to the current conflict and the history of Palestine, Israel. And finally, I'll encourage you to read our latest report called Presumptively Anti-Semitic: Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, to understand the causes and the effects of misusing the definition and weaponizing the concept of anti-Semitism for purposes of political censorship, as opposed to for the rightful purpose of preventing hatred towards Jews, and the importance of why we should not be conflating criticism of a nation state or a nation's military actions with a monolithic or world religion and the people who follow it, in this case, Judaism and the Jewish people. So On that note, I am delighted to be introducing today the speaker and the expert who will be delivering the Palestine teach-in on the West Bank and Jerusalem. Dr. Zachary Foster has a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is currently a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, History of the Idea of Palestine. He runs a digital archive called Palestine Nexus and writes a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox, which you can join online. And so without further ado, Dr. Foster, the virtual floor is yours, and we look forward to learning from your expertise. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And I am going to go into slideshow mode. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And let's get started. I have about 50 slides and about an hour, perhaps a bit less. So let's get started. Okay, so some basic facts and figures about the West Bank, which you see here pictured on the right. The West Bank is home to about 3 million Palestinians and about 700,000 Israeli settlers. The West Bank's boundaries are the 1949 armistice lines, that is to say, when the guns fell silent at the end of the 1948 war. That became the boundaries of the West Bank. And from 48 to 67, it was Jordan that occupied the West Bank. And then from 67 to the present, Israel has occupied the territory. And the legal status of the West Bank. So Israeli rule in the West Bank has been described as an apartheid regime by most major human rights organizations, as well as by most scholars of Israel-Palestine, as well as of Jewish studies. The 700,000 Israeli settlers that live in the West Bank vote for the government that controls their lives. They receive Israeli passports. They work and travel freely in Israel, while the 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank have no such rights. They do not vote for the government that controls their lives. They do not receive Israeli passports. They are not free to work and travel in Israel. And we're going to get into, obviously, the details of Israel's apartheid regime in the West Bank in much greater detail in the slides that follow. And again, this is just general overview. So the divisions within the West Bank, you have areas A, areas B, and areas C. Area A is supposed to be full Palestinian control. It includes the built-up areas in the West Bank. It's about 18% of the West Bank. Areas B is under full Israeli security control and under Palestinian civilian control, and then Area C is full Israeli and full Israeli security and civilian control. The economic situation in the West Bank, Palestinians have a GDP per capita of $3,500, and Palestinian youth unemployment is 43%. Okay, so let's talk very briefly about the period of the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank. Recall that in the 1948 war, Jordan occupied this territory, and there was something like 500,000 Palestinians that were made refugees in the West Bank and Jordan as a result of that war, as a result of Israeli policies during the war that led to the creation of more than 750,000 Palestinian refugees. And Jordan actually granted those Palestinian citizenship, and they also granted those Palestinians most of the rank and file jobs in the West Bank Civil Service Administration. Jordan feared that Palestinians would transform their demographic domination into political power, and this led the government of Jordan to basically put a gag order on all things Palestine. You could not describe yourself as a Palestinian. You could not say you were from Palestine. Those things could lead you to imprisonment in Jordan. And in the late 1940s and 1950s, many Palestinian refugees in the West Bank tried to return to their homes in the years following the 1948 war in order to recover lost property, see their relatives, graze their flocks, and also to commit acts of revenge against a state that made them refugees. And Israel adopted a policy of shoot to kill. Anyone crossing the border was killed, and this led to, in just the year and a half after the creation of the state of Israel, Israel slaughtered more than 1,000. Almost all of them were unarmed Palestinians. And then in the years to come, more of them picked up arms. And from 1948 to 1956, Israel killed somewhere between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinian refugees in their attempt to return to their homes in the years after the war. In the 1930s, recall that King Abdullah of Jordan actually supported the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states because that 1937 partition plan called for the incorporation of Palestine's Arab, that the Arab partition, the Arab portion of Mandate Palestine that was, that was supposed to go to the Palestinians. Actually, the partition plan called for its incorporation into Jordan, and so this raised the ire of Palestinians. They felt betrayed by Jordan, and the state of Jordan absorbed Palestinians rather than granting them self-rule. They accused Abdullah of stealing Palestinian land. And as well, recall that King Abdullah engaged in secret talks with Israel in the years after the war, and he actually sought to incorporate Gaza also into his own state. And this led to one Palestinian who had ties to Hajj Amin al-Husseini to assassinate King Abdullah of Jordan on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in July 1951. Now, let's fast forward to the 1967 war. And this is really going to be the main focus of the presentation. So from the period when Israel occupied the West Bank in June 1967 until I'm going to focus on really the events that led up to October 7th. This presentation is not going to cover in a direct way what has happened since October 7th. So in the 6 days during June 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Arab states became focused on the lands they lost during the war. Obviously, Egypt was very focused on recovering the Sinai, Syria on recovering the Golan. And this you could say this was a distraction, at least to the Palestinians. They were much more interested in recovering their own land than they were in freeing the Palestinians from Israeli occupation. By the end of 1967, poll numbers that were coming out of Israel indicated that the vast majority of Israelis supported keeping all of the territory occupied. There was a belief at the time that this miraculous military achievement in which Israel conquered all of this land, that this would provide Israel added security. And it also, there was many segments within Israeli society that believed this was a fulfillment of messianic prophecies. And in general, I would say the Israeli public basically rejected the idea of peace with its Arab neighbors, if it meant returning that land. And so there were many offers, especially between Israel and Egypt in the years immediately after 1967, in the late 60s and early 70s, in which in which Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat worked to try to pursue peace talks with Israel, but they were pretty much rejected because Israel realized it would require sacrifice, require withdrawal from land it illegally occupied. And during that 1967 war, it's not very well appreciated, but hundreds of thousands of more Palestinians were made refugees during that war. The estimates are between 250 and 300,000 Palestinians were displaced and were made refugees in that war. And it's not well appreciated how this happened. So it's worth spending a minute on this. There were extensive aerial attacks and as well as deliberate destruction of many Palestinian villages, Imwas, Yalu, Beit Nuba, Beit Marsum, etc. Israel also partially destroyed the Palestinian city of Qalqilia. It evicted the Palestinian refugees living in the camps of Aqabat Jabbar and Ain Sultan, and it threatened the mass detention of Palestinians in those areas. After the war, Israel organized buses for 200,000 Palestinians departing from Jerusalem and other areas of the West Bank, sending them to the border with Jordan, forcing them to sign documents, basically declaring they were leaving the country voluntarily. And Israel also continued its policy of kind of offering special inducements for Palestinians to leave the West Bank, owing to Israel's longstanding desire from the moment it conquered the West Bank to maintain permanent control of that territory. And of course, if Israel wants to maintain permanent control of a territory, it doesn't want Palestinians living in it, owing to its desire to maintain kind of Jewish domination and Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. Let's continue along. So a slide here on Israel's economic policies in the occupied West Bank, as well as Gaza, but let's focus on the West Bank here. So Israel's general policy here was to prevent Palestinian companies and businesses from competing with Israeli companies and businesses. And so it suffocated Palestinian entrepreneurship and investment and industry, instead pushing Palestinians to find jobs inside Israel. This process has been termed by academics and experts like Sarah Roy as de-development. In other words, to erode the economic base, the self-sustaining economic base of the occupied territories. And just to cite one example of this, so less land was under cultivation in 1987 than was in 1947 as a result of this de-development process. And the mechanism by which Israel imposed this de-development of the occupied territories was through its very suffocating permit regime that required Palestinians to get permits to do basically anything. And the result of this was that the industrial sector in the West Bank, while it accounted for 9% of the West Bank's GDP in 1968, right, when Israel occupied the territories, by the 1980s, it had by 1980 it had declined to 6.5%. Israel also created a dependent class of Palestinian business people whose profit lied in mediating between basically Israeli manufacturers and local markets. And this gave Israel extra leverage over both Palestinian laborers who were now dependent on the Israeli labor market for work, as well as a Palestinian business class, which was dependent on the state of Israel for their survival. And this is why, by the way, that when Israel started to impose closures and lockdowns in the 1990s, this had absolutely catastrophic consequences for the Palestinian economy. Now let's talk about political repression in the West Bank and, of course, Gaza during this period, during the first 20 years of Israel's military occupation of the territories. So Israel banned any political expressions, right? You could not organize 10 people for a political purpose. You cannot wave a Palestinian flag. You could not make artwork of red, black, green, and white. And in fact, Fathi Ghaban, a Palestinian in Gaza, sat 6 months in prison in 1982 for painting a painting using those four colors. Israel embraced a policy of mass detainment and deportation of anyone who resisted its rule. In one case, in 1976, Israel detained 34,000 people at once. And Israel also embraced a policy of deportation. It deported thousands of Palestinians from the territories. It arrested more than 500,000 Palestinians over the course of this 20-year period. Israel censored textbooks, magazines. It shut down many newspapers. It shut down a Palestinian news agency in the early 1980s and banned thousands of books. And Israel, generally speaking, sought to decrease the visibility of its military forces in Palestinian towns and cities to avoid political agitation. So it wanted the territories and it wanted to maintain political quietism in the West Bank and Gaza. Let's talk about Israel's land policies in the West Bank. If you had to summarize Israel's land policies in just a single sentence, it was control as much land as possible with as few Palestinians on that land as possible. And over the course of the past 56 years, Israel has confiscated more than 2 million dunams of land from Palestinians. So this is almost a third of the land of the West Bank has been confiscated from Palestinians. And over the next few slides, I'd like to get into a little bit of detail and depth on how Israel goes about confiscating that land, right? Because Israel sees itself as a state of laws, a state of order. So it has all these very intricate, complex legal systems which enable it to confiscate Palestinian land. And the first thing it did in 1968 was that it froze all of the land transactions in the West Bank. So recall that in those in the 18 years of Jordanian occupation from 48 to 67, only about 1/3 of the land in the West Bank had been registered in the Jordanian landholding books. It's a slow process, and after 18 years, only about 1/3 of the land was registered in the Jordanian land books, and so 2/3 of the land in the West Bank they had to go back basically to either British rule or even before that Ottoman rule in order to determine who had the legal right, who owned the land. And who had the title to that land. And so as a result, something like 90% of the land in the West Bank was now under cultivation by people who were not allowed to register that land. And by the way, there was an effort made by the Turkish government in the 2000s to send land deeds and titles to the Palestinian Authority so that they could prove to the Israelis that it was the Palestinians that owned this land. But there were, generally speaking, beyond this initial freeze in registrations, in land registrations, there were generally speaking 3 strategies Israel deployed to take over Palestinian land. The first was it established closed military zones, and it did that on 26% of the West Bank land. It declared lands state lands. And then established Jewish settlements on much of that land that was declared state land, and that was 22% of the West Bank. And then also it declared about 6% of the West Bank national parks. Those were the three strategies, and I'd like to get into a little bit more detail on each of those three. So between 1967 in 1975, Israel declared, like I said, about 27% of the West Bank closed military zones. And if you look exactly at the regions within the West Bank that were declared closed military zones, it was very clearly the land that Israel wanted to maintain permanent presence in and permanent control over. And in 1970, Israel closed off basically a north-south strip within the West Bank, running from Jericho down to the West Bank's southern boundary. In the mid 1970s, Israel Israel followed following the closure of several areas. It confiscated another 81,000 hectares of land. One of the areas that was targeted with these military zones was the Jordan Valley and the border with Jordan, because Israel, of course, wanted to maintain complete enclosure. It wanted to maintain basically military presence in all of the land that would enclose the West Bank, which obviously includes the border with Jordan. And so something like 75 to 85% of the land that was declared military zones was in the Jordan Valley. We're going to get to, I'll show a map that illustrates that in a subsequent slide. The Israeli army also frequently declares land and property closed military zones, allowing, and they do this not necessarily because they want to take over the land, but also whenever they want to impose basically limit freedoms of movement, as well as prevent demonstrations. They just declare the land a closed military zone, which enables them to basically suppress any kind of demonstration. Let's talk about the nature reserve. So 6%, like I said, of the West Bank has been declared a nature preserve, and this policy was recently embraced just a few years ago in 2020 and in 2022. So in 2020, Israel created 7 more nature reserves in the West Bank. It expanded 12 existing nature reserves. And then in 2022, Israel established its largest new nature reserve in the West Bank in 3 decades. And the current Israeli government has proposed a bill that would amend the law on natural parks and nature reserves in the West Bank. The amendment would formally annex these lands, these nature reserves, into Israel and impose Israeli law on them. And then, as I said, the third method was by declaring land state land. And the reason this picked up in the after 1979 was that the Israeli Supreme Court made passed a ruling that made it much more difficult for Israel to continue building settlements on privately owned Palestinian land. And so in order to overcome this obstacle, the Israeli government had a clever workaround. All they had to do was first declare the land as state land, and then they could just turn it into an Israeli settlement. And so from 1979 to 1992, Israel declared more than 90,000 hectares of land in the West Bank as state land, and allocated them for Jewish settlement. It's often forgotten, but the 1980s was really the period when Israel first began to rapidly expand its settlement enterprise. From 1992 to 1998, Israel tripled, in a period of 6 years leading up to the first Intifada. Israel tripled its settler population. And of course, Palestinians almost never win appeals against their land being declared state land or government property. And you see here pictured on the left, like I said, there was a predominance of land in the Jordan Valley, as you can see here. All of this land you see here in this map that's colored turquoise or blue or yellow or orange, all of this land has been declared state land. So it's, there's clearly a concentration in 2 areas, right? The Jordan Valley and the border with Jordan, as well as the a kind of an east-west line connecting Jerusalem to the Dead Sea and the border with Jordan, allowing Israel to both control the eastern boundary as well as allowing Israel to cut the West Bank in half. Let's move on. Okay, so this kind of the one other point I want to make before getting to the first Intifada is that between 73 and 92, Israel had a policy of basically shutting down the universities in the West Bank. And so during this period, Israel shut down Birzeit University, the largest university, and I would say the most prestigious university in the West Bank. It shut it down for a period of over 2,200 days, including almost, if you go from 88 to 92, the university was basically shut down almost continuously over the course of that four-year period during the first Intifada, which we're going to get to in just a minute. Israel also denies entry permits to many faculty who have been offered teaching appointments at the universities in the West Bank, and Israel also required that faculty teaching at Palestinian universities in the West Bank sign an oath declaring that they did not support the PLO. So we're talking about censorship of higher education in the West Bank, censorship over the curriculum, over the admission of students, the selection of textbooks, etc. So Israel is kind of trying to control what Palestinians are allowed to think, allowed to teach in the university system in the West Bank. So let's talk about kind of the lead up to the outbreak of the first Intifada, the first uprising. I would say, generally speaking, Palestinians experienced a tremendous amount of humiliation in the workplace. They were cheated out of wages. They were forced to work under inhumane conditions. They experienced retaliation. They were dehumanized at roadblocks and checkpoints. And I think a poll that was conducted in 1986 gives you a sense of the feeling among Palestinians in the occupied territories on the eve of the first uprising. Palestinians were asked, have you or a member of your family experienced any of the following? 75% had experienced curfew, 56% had experienced harassment or direct insults at checkpoints, 51% were physically abused or beaten, 48% had experienced political arrest, 34% were banned from traveling abroad, 23% had property or land confiscated, 18% had their homes demolished or sealed, and 16% had experienced a town arrest or had a member of their family deported. This leads to the outbreak of the first Intifada, the first uprising. And like I said, this really was the result. It was the culmination of 20 years of brutal military occupation, of constant harassment and repression and beatings and intimidation and manipulation. And it was primarily a nonviolent uprising that swept across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It set in motion a series of daily strikes and protests and riots and boycotts of Israeli rule, and infamously stone throwing Palestinian children. And in the first 2 years of that uprising, Israel killed about 175 Palestinians sat in Israeli prison. Yitzhak Rabin, then defense minister of Israel, ordered his soldiers to break the bones of the Palestinian children. 30,000 Palestinian kids needed medical treatment for having their bones broken by Israeli soldiers. About a third of the Palestinians whose bones were broken were under the age of 10, and about a fifth were under the age of 5. We're talking about 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids having their bones broken. Israel killed about 1,200 Palestinians during the uprising, and Palestinians killed about 160 Israelis. The vast majority of the Israelis killed were soldiers, whereas the vast majority of the Palestinians killed were civilians. This kind of brings us to Oslo and the Oslo process. And actually, I think, let's okay, I don't have a slide here on exactly what the Oslo process included, but just to summarize kind of what Oslo was in a nutshell, it was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian umbrella group that kind of managed, was sort of a government in exile, if you will, and operated first in Jordan and then in Lebanon, and by the 1980s had been expelled from Lebanon in the 1982 war and wound up in Tunisia. That organization, which came to be seen really as the representation of the Palestinian people in the international community, in the eyes of the world, they signed this agreement with the state of Israel in 1993, which basically started to transfer over sections of the West Bank and Gaza to this new authority, this Palestinian Authority, which is a creation of the process. And it was allowed to manage certain aspects of affairs in the West Bank. And basically the basic idea of Oslo was that the Palestinians would start to get some amount of autonomy, some amount of self-rule within the territories, but all the critical issues, right? The borders, refugees, Jerusalem, water, resources, right? All these important issues, they would be negotiated at a time not exceeding 5 years from the signing of the agreement, which was in 1993. And I would say one of the critical things that resulted from Oslo was this cantonization of the West Bank into 3 areas, like we mentioned on the first slide, right? Areas A, B, and C. And you might say, Area A is supposed to be, again, Palestinian full security and civil control. Areas B is kind of Palestinian civil Israeli security, and Area C is full Israeli security control. Areas C and B constitute 80% of the West Bank, right? So basically, this is the area Israel had kind of wanted to maintain control over, had wanted to maintain a permanent military presence in, and it's 80% of the West Bank. And essentially, wherever there are not Palestinians, wherever there are not dense urban Palestinian population centers, Israel wanted to maintain permanent military control. And as we'll discover in the next a few slides, it has been Israel's policy of trying to push Palestinians from areas C to areas B and from areas B to areas A, trying to crowd Palestinians into the urban centers of the West Bank. And the way I would describe Oslo, and the way I would try to make sense of Oslo and why it failed, is that Israel was both a party to the Oslo Accords, but it was also the enforcer of the Oslo Accords, being the only sovereign between the river and the sea. The Oslo Accords did not require Israel to end the occupation and the settlement expansion and the land confiscations or the home demolitions or the administrative detentions in which it kidnaps Palestinians for no reason and puts them in prison. And it did not require Israel to end its policy of targeted assassinations or checkpoints or lockdowns. Whenever there was a trade-off that had to be made between Israeli security and Palestinian human rights, Palestinian democracy to Palestinian development, Israel almost always chose its own security interests first, which is why over the course of the 1990s, Israel imposed these suffocating lockdowns on Palestinian communities in Gaza and the West Bank. And you see here over the course of the 90s, for example, in 1995, Israel imposed lockdowns during 85 days. And then 90 days in 96. And these lockdowns had dramatic consequences for Palestinians, right? After having made Palestinians dependent on the Israeli labor market from 87 to 90, from 1967 to 1987, Israel then locked down the territories and thus created astronomical unemployment rates reaching 50% during periods of total lockdown. And I would say Israel, generally speaking, exacerbated this atmosphere of distrust through its land confiscations. It doubled its settler population from 93 to 2000, such that on the eve of the Camp David Accords, when Israel and the Palestinians were sat down to negotiate who would ultimately take control over the land that Israel had already been taking control over for the previous 7 years. And I would say, generally speaking, this was a bad idea to even host these negotiations in the first place. Yasser Arafat said the conditions are not ready. We are not ready. The Israelis are not ready. The Americans are not ready. Bill Clinton had an election. There was an election in the United States. And 6 months after these accords, there was an election in Israel just a few months after. And so there was a tremendous amount of pressure to come to an agreement very quickly, which Yasser Arafat wisely acknowledged was unlikely because there was just simply too much ground, too much distance between the Israeli and the Palestinian positions, as we'll see in just a minute. So on Jerusalem, Israel proposed, Ehud Barak proposed a capital in Abu Dis, which is not in Jerusalem. Palestinians demanded a capital in East Jerusalem. On the question of borders, Israel said wanted to maintain control over all the settlement blocks, and it would retain control over something like 14% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, including the Jordan River, including multiple settler compounds, and including its settlement in Hebron, which divided the city into two. Israel would maintain control over the groundwater and airspace. And I think if you're trying to understand if this was really a fair negotiation process, just ask yourself, did Palestinians get to control Israeli airspace and Israeli groundwater? Did Palestinians get 3 military outposts in Israel? Did Palestinians get to control Israel's border with Lebanon or with Syria? No, it did not. So these were obviously negotiations that took place under Israeli kind of framework and sort of Israeli needs, Israeli security desires. And of course, on the refugee issue, Arafat demanded the Palestinian right of return to Israel with some flexibility and insisted on Israeli admission of responsibility. But of course, Israel opposed accepting any responsibility of any kind and proposed a right of return to a future Palestinian state. So to summarize, these Oslo the Camp David Accords, there was just so much distance between the sides, and so the negotiations broke down. And the result was after Ariel Sharon takes a very who's then Israeli defense minister, takes a very provocative visit on the Temple Mount, on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, basically asserting Israeli sovereignty over the holiest site to Palestinian Muslims. There's protests the next day. Israel kills 14 Palestinian children over the course of the next 3 weeks. And lo and behold, there is another uprising. The second intifada breaks out, during which Palestinians commit many gruesome attacks on Israelis, including Bus 37, as you see here pictured in a suicide attack on Haifa, which killed 17 Israelis. So over the course of these 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, Palestinian militants, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, slaughter 1,000 Israeli civilians in 138 suicide attacks. This is 3 to 4 times as deadly a period for Israelis as the entire decade combined. And Arafat paid money to the families of the suicide bombers. This has been a constant source of criticism by the United States and Israel of the Palestinian Authority. Israel retaliated by killing 3,000 Palestinians during that same period. So 3x the violence. This is a theme in Israeli response and retaliation to Palestinian violence, which is however many Palestinians kill Israelis, we will kill 3, 4, 5, 10, 100, 1,000 times as many Palestinians in response. Let's talk about, let's get a little bit into more detail and depth on the cantonization of the West Bank, as you see here on the right. Palestinians are confined into something like 165 non-contiguous territorial islands that can and often are severed one from the other for any reason at any time. Many Jewish settlements in the West Bank were established with the explicit purpose of thwarting the expansion of the Palestinian cities. For example, settlement construction was prioritized on the Mountain Ridge Road, Route 60, to prevent Palestinian development from moving eastward. Then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2001 said, quote, "It's not by accident that the settlements are located where they are, so that, quote, come what may, we have to hold the Western security area, which is, the western border with Israel, which is adjacent to the Green Line, and we have to control the eastern security area along the Jordan River, and as well as the roads linking the two. That's that point, that connection in the middle, and of course Jerusalem, and of course the Hill Aquifer." Which kind of leads us into a discussion of water. Obviously, water critical issue in the Israel-Palestine question. Israel extracts something like 90% of the West Bank's mountain aquifer, leaving Palestinians only 10%. Of course, even though Palestinians are 3 million in the West Bank and Israeli settlers are 800,000, and this split is, so in the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority agreed actually to an 80-20 split, but recall the problem with the Oslo Accords was that Israel is both party to the agreement and the enforcer of the agreement, and so Israel decides how much water it takes. There's no veto on that, and so even though they agreed to 80-20, it's probably more like 90-10 according to experts. And this is not to mention that even though Palestinians represent 80% of the population of the West Bank and 100% of its legal occupation, they only have access to 10% of its water. Israel retained near total control of all the water in the West Bank. It controls how much rain water Palestinians are allowed to collect through water cisterns. So if you erect a water cistern, which is just a tank to collect rainwater, without a permit, you are in violation of Israeli military law. Israel controls also the installation of new water pumps and wells, the deepening of existing wells, and it controls, of course, the Jordan River and the fresh water springs within the West Bank. Only 36%, this is a statistic that is not well appreciated, only 36% of West Bank Palestinians have access to running water on a daily basis. 100,000 Palestinians in 70 communities in the West Bank are not hooked up to the water grid. And many households have to spend as much as 40% of their income buying water from Israel. Many have called this water apartheid, owing to the disparities. West Bank settlements consume 5x the amount of water as Palestinians consume, even though the settlers are there illegally, and the West Bank the Palestinians are the native inhabitants. For personal use, while Palestinians are not permitted to access new water resources without permits, which are usually denied, most new Israeli settlements get connected to the Israeli national water supply, as a matter of course, automatically. For example, between 2010 and 2016, Israel permitted Palestinians to build 2 new water wells while demolishing 11 water wells. Of course, the Israeli settlements also use a tremendous amount of water for industrial purposes like dairy farms and vineyards and orchards, whereas the Palestinians of the Jordan Valley have been systematically deprived of their traditional means of livelihood as farmers and herders. Let's talk about the West Bank, the barrier known as the wall, the security fence. It goes by different names. Israeli Jews and Palestinians have very diametrically opposing views, I would say, on the security barrier. Israelis see it as necessary to save lives and reduce terrorism. Palestinians are convinced that the wall is a land grab and a weapon of control. And depending on where you stand on things, you might come to a conclusion that lies somewhere in the middle of those two positions. The barrier imposes what is not up for dispute, though, is that the barrier imposes tremendous hardship on the Palestinians. Significant tens of thousands of Palestinians have been separated from their farmland and their places of study. What is also not up for debate that 85% of the security barrier lies inside the Green Line, right? It lies on the Palestinian side of the Green Line. It protrudes in some areas 22 kilometers into the West Bank, and which is, of course, because the wall is by all I think by all accounts, it is political. The route was political. The route was chosen almost as a kind of de facto border where Israel decided it wanted land for settlement expansion. It built the wall further into Palestinian territory. The route of the wall, and this has been said by many Israeli military officials, and this is not really up for debate. The route of the wall was chosen for political and demographic reasons, not military or legal reasons. Here are some photos of the wall, the fence. In many places, it's 30 feet high concrete wall. In many places, it's a fence, which created a new kind of Palestinian. So, like we said, we had Palestinians living in Area A, Area B, Area C, and now we have Palestinians living in the seam zone, which creates almost a fourth category of West Bank Palestinians as part of Israel's kind of long-standing policy of divide and conquer, create divisions within Palestinian society. So these Palestinians who live in the seam zone, right, they are on the Israeli side of the security barrier, but they're West Bank Palestinians. So they're basically barred from entering Israel because they're West Bank Palestinians, but now they're also prevented from entering Palestine. So they're just trapped in these little territorial islands where access to basic needs to their property is denied. And it requires permits, of course. And so the seam zone also contains about 12% of all the potential farmland in the West Bank. More than 20 wells fall in the seam zone, significantly limiting the Palestinians' ability to use and access these water resources, as well as cutting off Palestinians from about 70% of the Western Aquifer Basin. Another aspect of Israeli military occupation in the West Bank is its quote-unquote bypass roads, which have been dubbed apartheid roads. Why? Because only Israelis can drive on them. Palestinians, they're in the West Bank, they're cutting across West Bank towns and villages, connecting Israeli settlements to Israel proper. But of course, Palestinians are not allowed to drive on them. Instead, Palestinians have been allowed to build basically these kind of more rudimentary secondary roads that run alongside and underneath Israeli-only roads that oftentimes have gates that can be closed to prevent Palestinians from moving to different parts of the West Bank. Let's talk a little bit about the Palestinian Authority. So, like we said, the Palestinian Authority was a creation of the Oslo process, and much criticism has been leveled against the Palestinian Authority over the past couple of decades. The Palestinian Authority, again, is this kind of pseudo, government. I think the more accurate description of it is basically the, Israel's Israel's enforcer. Israel carries out its occupation of policies and practices through the Palestinian Authority. So you might say Mahmoud Abbas is the chief, Israel's chief occupation officer, and they play an active role in restricting Palestinian rights, in restricting freedom of assembly. They routinely arrest people who protest peacefully. They torture. There's many documented cases of torturing Palestinian prisoners, and of course, recall that. In 2021, Israel Palestinian Authority security services brutally murdered Nizar Banat, a Palestinian activist who opposed the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas has indefinitely postponed elections. He is a Palestinian. He has led the Palestinian Authority, I think now for 14, 15 years on a 4-year term. PA is obviously infamous for its corruption and for its funneling of lucrative contracts to cronies and family members and friends of the regime. And so I think at this point, the Palestinian Authority is often considered as part of Israel's military occupation rather than representing some kind of opposition to it. And of course, that has a lot to do with the security cooperation. Whenever Israel enters towns and villages in the West Bank, whenever it goes into Jenin, like it did in July 2023 to destroy 3,000 Palestinian homes and kill 24 Palestinians, it of course requires, doesn't really require, I mean, it collaborates with the Palestinian Authority to enter those Palestinian towns. It shares intelligence with Israel. It helps Israel arrest Palestinian suspects and helps Israel raid Palestinian towns. And of course, the PA security forces are complicit in Israel's permit system. They help Israel implement the permit system that controls where Palestinians are allowed to go, whether or not they're allowed to enter Israel, and so on and so forth. I want to talk briefly about the nonviolent resistance movement in the West Bank. And beginning in 2003, when Israel began to construct the wall, you had a half dozen some Palestinian villages whose land was being confiscated by the wall. You had these mass protest movements where in Bil'ain and Nil'ain and Nabi Saleh and Beit Sida, you had Palestinians and international activists and Israelis going out every Friday to protest the construction of the wall and the confiscation of their land. And in many, many cases, they were confronted with lethal Israeli violence in response. And there are many, many documented cases where Palestinian nonviolent protesters were slaughtered by Israeli security personnel in the Palestinian-occupied territories, especially in the West Bank, from 2000 to the present. These protest movements continued in 2020 in places like Sheikh Jarrah and Beitah, where Palestinians gathered weekly to protest policies of land confiscations and ethnic cleansing. And in Beitah alone, I believe more than 10 to 15 Palestinians have been slaughtered. These are innocent Palestinian protesters just protesting the confiscation of their lands, have been killed by the Israeli army in just the past few years. Let's just talk briefly about the international community's kind of response to all of this. So we're now hearing repeated calls for a two-state solution. This has long been the position of the international community, is that the West Bank is occupied, is that Gaza is occupied, and that ultimately the only solution to the Israel-Palestine question is a political solution. The UN Security Council has passed numerous resolutions calling for an end to the Israeli occupation. The European Union has also called for an end to the occupation and the creation of a Palestinian state. As well, in 2002, led by Saudi Arabia, the Arab Peace Initiative offered total normalization with Israel in exchange for withdrawal from the territories, a just settlement of the refugee issue, as well as a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. Let's talk briefly about the telecommunication and internet policy in the West Bank. So I think one thing that is incredibly enraging to Palestinians, because there's no obvious security justification here, it's just to make life difficult for Palestinians, is that Israel banned 3G. In other words, it banned high-speed internet on mobile phones in the West Bank until 2018, even though that technology had been available and was being used in Israel for more than a decade. To this day, Israel blocks Palestinians in the West Bank from access to 4G, apparently owing to the security risks associated with watching TikTok videos on the go. Since 2001, Israel has prevented the expansion of the telecommunication network outside of cities in the West Bank. In other words, 80% of the West Bank. Palestinians are forbidden from erecting cell towers, installing equipment without Israeli approval. So basically, Israel controls the telecommunication network and internet access via mobile devices. Palestinian cellular companies lost potentially as much as $1.5 billion in just the years 2013 to 2015 alone, owing to these Israeli restrictions. Of course, one of the central pillars of Israel's occupation policies has been the restrictions that it places on freedom of movement. This really began, I would say, in earnest in 1991, when Israel changed its policy of allowing any Palestinian in the West Bank or Gaza to work in Israel, and after that point, required Palestinians to obtain an individual permit to enter Israel or to enter East Jerusalem. Israel set up hundreds of checkpoints, both between Israel and the West Bank, but also within the West Bank. Some 600 permanent obstacles have been set up within the West Bank, right? So preventing Palestinians from moving from Ramallah to Nablus, or from Bethlehem to Hebron, you would encounter Israeli checkpoints moving between those places. This has strangled the Palestinian economy, made it difficult and expensive to obtain raw materials and to transport goods and to conduct any business really that requires human labor, because businesses that require human labor require people to be able to move freely from their places of residence to their places of work. And of course, Israel has also severed the West Bank from Gaza. Again, you cannot, if you needed a permit to enter Israel, well, how is it that you get from the West Bank to Gaza? You need to go through Israel. Israel has also maintained control over the population registry, and this has had really disastrous consequences for two groups of people. And so these two groups are, if you were a foreign spouse of a Palestinian since 2000, when Israel froze changes to the Palestinian registry, you cannot get a permit. To live in occupied West Bank, you cannot get a permit. So if you're a foreign spouse of a Palestinian from the West Bank, and after 2000, your status as an occupied West Bank person is very much kind of under threat. You could be deported at any time for any reason. The second group of people were people who were Palestinians living in the West Bank, but their registered address is in the Gaza Strip. Again, there's no updates being made to the Palestinian registry, so your residency status in the West Bank is illegal, and you could also be deported at any time for any reason, owing to your status as an illegal resident of the West Bank. International aid. This is a very controversial topic, but the estimates are that something like 71% of all the international aid to the Palestinians actually ends up in the Israeli economy. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Some of the aid funds occupation infrastructure directly, such as checkpoint scanners. Many of the goods and services that are required for these aid projects, like transportation and logistics, storage facilities, pharmaceuticals, they cannot be bought within the Palestinian market owing to restrictions placed on Palestinian firms, and generally speaking, owing to the restrictions placed on Palestinian freedom of movement. And so, and because of this, these international aid actors have to source much of the aid they have to source from Israeli companies. So the aid to the Palestinians actually benefits Israel more so than it does the Palestinians. On top of all that, the aid to the Palestinians must, of course, first be converted into Israeli shekels, which supports and strengthens Israel's central bank and its ability to issue debt financing, thus helping Israeli citizens, but of course not Palestinians in the occupied territories. And I think it's important to emphasize here that really beginning in the 2020s, but of course, Palestinians had been calling this system an apartheid system for long before that, as have some Israeli NGOs as well, like ICAD. But basically, beginning in the 2020s, most, if not every major human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, as well as all the Palestinian and Israeli NGOs like B'Tselem, Al-Damir, Al-Haq, Miftah, Al-Mizan. So basically every major human rights organization that has anything interesting to say about Israel-Palestine has described the situation in the West Bank as apartheid. And the reason I think is pretty obvious. You could have claimed perhaps, maybe informed observers would take issue with this point, but maybe you could be a reasonable person and say in the 1990s that Israel did show its intention of withdrawing from the territories. But I think by now, 23 years after the Oslo process has been dead, very few people, if anyone, really believes that Israel is going to withdraw from the West Bank. In fact, what has happened over the past 20, 30, 40 years is the exact opposite, is the expansion of Israeli control over the West Bank, is a dramatic increase in the number of settlers, a dramatic increase in the number of land confiscations, and expansion of Israeli natural parks in the West Bank. So the trend is one way, right? It's Israel is intensifying and expanding its control in the West Bank. And so in a world where you have 3 million Palestinians and 800,000 Israelis living in a land controlled by Israel, and the Israelis have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, and the Palestinians do not have the right to vote for the government that controls their lands. There's only one conclusion left, which is that this is an apartheid regime, and that's why every major human rights organization has called it an apartheid regime, especially in the past couple of years. Let's talk a bit more. I apologize. I'm kind of, the slides could be in a better order, so I apologize for that. But we're kind of bouncing around here a little bit. But but basically, as I said before, the that area that connects Jerusalem on the west side and the Jordan Valley and the border with Jordan on the east side, this is a very important area for Israel because it allows Israel to, again, maintain this ability to cut the West Bank into two, as well as provide a buffer on the eastern side to Jerusalem. And so it has long sought control over this area, which means it has long sought to push Palestinians out of this area. And this area is called E1. And so over the course of the past 20, 30 years, Israel has been on a campaign to basically ethnically cleanse the area of Palestinians. And I would say the most famous case has been the Palestinian community of Khan al-Ahmar, where you have 180 Palestinians who have faced constant threats of displacement. Israel also maintains digital control over Palestinians. So we're talking about censoring Palestinian content online. This has actually dramatically worsened over the past 2 months. But basically trying to control what Palestinians see, what information they consume, what content they share. The Israeli army increasingly also relies on facial recognition technology to track Palestinians and restrict their passage through key checkpoints. Israeli soldiers use a special app to photograph Palestinians wherever they see them on the streets or during home raids. They maintain a central database. We're talking like, Chinese communist government level, basically like controlling every face of every Palestinian, where they are, where they go, when they go where, of every single last Palestinian in the West Bank. They, of course, do not apply this kind of control to Israelis. They do not use this technology on Israelis. Israel continues to expand, its network of cameras in the occupied territories, and this has a psychologically tormenting effect on every Palestinian in the West Bank. Quote, "I'm being watched the whole time. It gives me a bad feeling everywhere in the street. Every time I see a camera, I feel anxious." Psychological torture is how I would describe that. Of course, Israel embraces a policy of home demolitions. Since 1967, Israel has demolished 28,000 Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Most of these homes are demolished owing to lack of permits. Israel also embraced the policy of demolishing homes, basically wherever it wants to take over land, right? So in East Jerusalem, it has a policy of so basically where you have land that Israel wants to maintain permanent control over, those areas have the highest number of home demolitions in East Jerusalem, especially in the neighborhoods immediately around the Old City and in the Old City itself, like Silwan, like Sheikh Jarrah. Then it also has a policy of demolishing homes in the E1 zone, like we said, as well as the South Hebron Hills and Masaf Riyata, as well as in the Jordan Valley. And just to cite one statistic, which I find absolutely insane, and perhaps you will as well, from 2006 to 2016 to 2018, Israel issued 100 times more home demolition orders than it did building permits in Area C of the West Bank, the area that Israel wants to ultimately maintain total control over and ultimately annex into Israel. You are 100 times more likely to be told that your home is going to be demolished than you are to be given a permit to build a home. So let's so then let's talk briefly about Palestinian children, who are an average of, over the past 20 years, an average of between 500 and 700 Palestinian children are detained by the Israeli occupation forces every year. We're talking about 13,000 Palestinian children have been arbitrarily detained, interrogated, and tried in military courts. And we all know conviction rates in military courts, I believe, is 99.7%. As of September 2023, 38 Palestinian children have been killed by Israeli forces. This data was all pulled before October 7th, of course. Since then, everything has gotten 100, if not 1,000 times worse. As of September 2023, 38 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli security forces, making it the deadliest year on record since they started keeping records of Palestinian children detainees. It was the second consecutive year that's a record. So 2022 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children on record, and then 2023 exceeded that. And obviously, all the more so since October 7th. Palestinian children in Israeli detention face abuse, physical and emotional. 4 out of 5 Palestinian children are beaten physically. They're strip searched. They're injured at the point of arrest, including gunshot wounds and broken bones, and others report sexual violence and other heinous crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces. We talked a lot about, we've kind of alluded to the occupation kind of permit regime, but here I just like to break it down in a little bit more detail. So you have living permits. So this is one area where Israel expels Palestinians from the West Bank. The right to live in the West Bank can be permanently revoked if you're a Palestinian and somehow manage to get a permit to leave the West Bank, which is required to leave, of course. And if you're out for more than 3 years, you can be stripped of your right to be an occupied West Bank person. And in fact, 140,000 Palestinians have been stripped of that right. Then you have the family reunification permit. So since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Israel has froze that family reunification process, ceasing to give West Bank residency status to the children of West Bank Palestinians born overseas or born to foreign spouses. We discussed this a little bit already. And this freeze has placed tens of thousands of people under a constant threat of deportation. And then, of course, work permits. Israel grants work permits to Palestinians. I believe on the eve of the October 7th attacks, you had maybe somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Palestinians in the West Bank were granted work permits to enter Israel. And Israel uses its policy of work permits as leverage over Palestinians to pressure them into political quietism, to pressure them into abandoning a political struggle, and instead just focusing on an ability to maintain livelihood and subsist. We have also many cases of forcible transfer, such as the case of Khan al-Ahmar, which I've already talked about and alluded to. We have also the case of Masaf Riyata, which in 2022, after a 2-decade-long legal battle, the Israeli Supreme Court gave the Israeli military the green light to expel the 1,800 residents of the Masaf Riyata area. I think it's 1,000 in Masaf Riyata and 800 in some of the surrounding hamlets. This would be the single largest expulsion decision. Well, I guess October 7th has changed all that, but at least prior to that, this would have been the single largest expulsion decision since 1967. The Israeli army also informed Palestinian officials of their imminent plan to displace these Palestinians in January 23. And there's been many protests in Masaf Riyata since then, and the army harasses anyone who tries to enter Masaf Riyata to protest. You also have the forcible transfer of Khirbat Khomsa. 70 Palestinians were made homeless there. You also had many Palestinians, they expelled those residents something like 7 times. They kept returning, and every time they returned, their homes would be demolished again, and they would be expelled again. You also have forcible transfer and ethnic cleansing in Ain Samia and Ras Al-Tin. More than 178 Palestinian Bedouin living there were forcibly transferred in 2023. Their homes were demolished. Their livelihood was threatened. Their grazing land was taken away by settler expansion. 100 people in Ras Al-Tin were expelled in July 2023. And then more Palestinians, 81 Palestinians were expelled, pushed out of their communities in Wadi Asiq and Lifchim. Just 1 or 2 more slides here. We're almost about to wrap up. In 2020, so over the past couple of years, you had the emergence of new Palestinian armed groups in the West Bank, the Lions Den and the Jenin Brigade. These are new Palestinian militant groups comprised primarily of young Palestinian men carrying out attacks on Israeli military targets and Israeli civilians, Israeli settlers, actually primarily in the West Bank and also in Israel proper, which led to the killing of 21 Israelis. And of course, Israel does what it always does. It uses disproportionate violence against Palestinians in response. And in just 2023 alone, again, all this data is before October 7th. Obviously, Israel killed more than 200 Palestinians in the West Bank. Since October 7th, Israel's killed another more than 200, I believe, 20 Palestinians in the West Bank. But this data is from before October 7th. Israel also embraces a policy of divide and rule. It tries to recruit Palestinians in the West Bank as collaborators and informants, and entraps and blackmails them to achieve its military objectives. For example, in 2023, Zuhair al-Ghalith was blackmailed, but when an Israeli undercover agent engage in sexual relations with him, and then threatened to leak the videos, compelling him to help locate members of these resistance groups. This is part of Israel's long-standing policy of creating division, internal division within Palestinian society. It's always easier to defeat your adversary when they are divided, rather than united. And this has created, I think, the second order effect of this has been to create, violence within Palestinian society. There's constant suspicion and fear that Palestinians are collaborating with Israel and spying on one another. And thus, in the first Intifada alone, you had more than 900 Palestinians were killed by other Palestinian groups out of fear of collaboration. 100 during the second Intifada, and this continues to this day, where Palestinians are killing other Palestinians owing to the Israeli policy of recruiting and blackmailing and entrapping Palestinians into a policy of collaboration. Palestinians have also faced attacks on civil society. So the Israeli occupation authorities continue to crack down on Palestinian human rights and civil institutions. In 2021, they declared 7 Palestinian human rights organizations were declared terrorist organizations. So I think the irony, of course, is that these are the organizations that provide an antidote and a counterweight to actual terrorism were declared terrorist organizations for doing the very terrorist things like, documenting Israeli human rights violations. And of course, there was no evidence to support this because they're, of course, not terrorist organizations. And so diplomatic missions from 17 countries, including Britain and France and the United Nations, condemned this action by Israel, declaring it totally baseless because there was no evidence provided to claim that these were terrorist organizations. You see here a photograph on the right where Israeli soldiers raid the Palestinian human rights organization's office, Al-Haq. Israel also has a policy of administrative detention and torture. As of April 2021, Israel held 4,000 Palestinians from the West Bank in custody for security offenses, including 400 in administrative detention. I think that the number of Palestinians who had been detained for unknown reasons, they were just basically kidnapped, I would say. They were just arrested without having been told why, without having been told what the offense was. This reached 1,000 on the eve of October 7th. These people sit in jail for years in many cases without being charged of any crimes. The Israeli occupation authorities continue as well to use, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques. As you see here, pictured on the right, this has been documented in many, many cases, including the case of Hamza Zahran and Abdul Majid Mansour. Israeli prison authorities use an inhumane interrogation practice known as the banana position. Israel also targets journalists, infamously killing Shireen Abu Akleh in 2022 in what a CNN investigation, we're talking about CNN, which is famous for parroting Israeli military talking points, concluded it was quite likely not an accident, but it was a targeted assassination. And she's, of course, not the only one. Israel's killed many, many Palestinians, including many Palestinian journalists over the past few decades. And I know I said that I was wrapping up, and I believe this, maybe, I think I have one or two more. Yes, two final slides. Settler violence has increased dramatically over the past couple of years. 900 documented, this is just the documented cases of settler violence against Palestinians in 2021. 90+% of those who commit the acts of violence are never charged with anything, let alone tried for anything. Settlers frequently stone and shoot at Palestinian cars. The violence often occurs in front of Israeli soldiers who rarely interfere, and when they do, it's usually on behalf of the Israeli settlers committing violence. Of course, some settlements have made Palestinian life in the territories unbearable, and like in Hebron, where the presence of a few hundred Israeli settlers has led to mass exodus of thousands of Palestinians from the city center, shutting down Palestinian businesses and leading to major restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement in Hebron. And just a last line here, which is the settler violence that has been dubbed pogroms in the past year or two. In June 2023, 400 settlers descended on the villages of Tormas Aya and Ramallah, torching cars and homes. As you can see here, a house burned by settlers in the town of Tormas Aya in 2023. In February, more than 100 settlers raided the village of Huara, killing at least one Palestinian, injuring 350 Palestinians on a single day. It was an act of terror, and it was a pogrom. And of course, none of the 90% plus of the perpetrators of violence are never charged with anything, let alone tried with anything. And I will end my presentation. I have slides here on resources for books and for documentaries and for media and civil society organizations that you can follow if you want to read more and learn more. And with that, I will end my presentation, and I'm going to pass it back over to Professor Aziz, who I believe is going to moderate a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foster. You always give us so many facts to process, and I appreciate the fact that you focus primarily on facts to allow the audience to think for itself and interpret the facts to show what, in large part, is a pretty clear conclusion, right? And as you said, many of the international organizations, civil rights organizations, human rights organizations have come to the conclusion that what is happening in Palestine, the West Bank, and in Gaza is an apartheid system. So this causes me to ask a question that I don't think is discussed enough, and that is, the story you've told, right, with these facts shows that the situation has been for decades miserable, untenable, insufferable for Palestinians. And I think you made a good explanation or description of the reasons why the Palestinian Authority's popularity has decreased significantly in the West Bank, notwithstanding the optimism that some people, not all people, but some people had with the Oslo Agreement. How does this affect the popularity of Hamas? How does this affect the Palestinians' attempt for self-determination? If you have a Palestinian Authority that has effectively become the subcontractor to, whether you want to call it occupation, colonialism, apartheid, but clearly not a democratic or sovereign entity. And so what is the alternative, and to what extent do you think Israel is fully aware of the alternatives, and what's its role? Right, so I guess it's a twofold question, which is how has this impacted Hamas, and what do you think Israel's strategy is behind this clear trend away from self-determination? You're muted.
Thank you. I think that you got it exactly right. I think the reason why Hamas rose in popularity beginning in the 90s and continuing in the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s was because the alternative to Hamas was Israeli occupation and its subcontract to the Palestinian Authority. Right. So Hamas represented resistance to that occupation, resistance to that apartheid, resistance to land confiscations and home demolitions and mass detainments and mass arrests. And that's the reason I think why Hamas grew in popularity. Hamas, recall as well, was a charity organization for its first 15 years and continued to be a charity organization alongside its militant activities. Again, so it had, Hamas had grassroots support. It operated 50% of the mosques in the occupied territories. It operated a network of schools. It funded orphanages. So it had a popular base of support. Whereas the Palestinian Authority is really, I would say, a legacy of the PLO, which came from the outside, which was a group of Palestinians who were brought in, who were kind of revolutionaries struggling in exile. Were brought in, were given this power, were given funding from the United States, allowed to create a security service that tortures Palestinians, allowed to embezzle hundreds of millions of dollars of money, all under the watchful eye of the United States and Israel. And so it lost a ton of popularity. And ultimately, I think for most Palestinians in the West Bank, it has really just become to be seen as really part of the Israeli occupation authority apparatus. And then the second part of your question, Just could you say that one more time?
Yeah, it's primarily is where do you see the Israeli government in all of this? You know, there have been multiple narratives. One is that, and some may be in fact true, and some may be conspiracy theories, but one narrative is that Israel supported Hamas, has funded Hamas at some point in time, and may arguably even continue to have supported Hamas at least existence because it needed a militant group to use or to point to deflect from its increasingly cruel and brutal occupation and apartheid practices. Another narrative is that no, it has been against Hamas, and in fact, you know, Hamas's success has been despite Israel. So where do you see kind of the Israeli government and its strategies with regard to how it is dealing with both the PA and Hamas?
I would describe the relationship between Israel and Hamas as it's complicated. I would say that, look, in the early 90s, I believe it was 1990 or 1991, Israel deported not just the first echelon of Hamas leaders in the occupied territories, but also the second and the third. They deported 420 Palestinians from the occupied territories to Lebanon. They tried to eradicate the organization in 1990. Actually, before I think it had committed one attack on Israeli civilians at that point. So that was the attitude and of course throughout the 90s, they assassinated as many Hamas leaders as they could. They sought to destroy the organization. And then after 2005, after the January 2005 elections or 2006 elections in which Hamas won, surprisingly, Israel then sought to it sought to sabotage the agreements that were being made between Fatah and Hamas. It did not want Hamas to become part of the official organized political Palestinian establishment. All the more so after it signed an agreement with Fatah, because and so it sought to undermine them. And then when Hamas took power in Gaza in June 2007, Israel wanted to punish the people of Gaza and the West Bank, but it was where Gaza where they took over. So Israel wanted to punish the people of Gaza for electing Hamas, so imposes this blockade on Hamas and Gaza. But I think by the 2010s, I would say probably by, Bibi Netanyahu gets elected in 2009 and has served as prime minister of Israel for the majority of the past 14 years. And already by 2017, you have actually maybe even just going back further. So in 2008, 2009, Israeli leaders do not say directly our goal is to eradicate Hamas. They want to weaken Hamas. The same is true in 2012. They want to undermine Hamas's military capabilities, but keep them in power. And then by the mid 2000s, you have Qatari officials traveling from Doha to Tel Aviv, landing in Ben Gurion Airport with suitcases full of cash, delivering that cash to Hamas, all under the full knowledge and support of the Israeli government. By 2017, Bezalel Smotrich says Hamas is our asset, not our liability, because if Hamas is in power, then we don't have to negotiate with the Palestinians. We don't have to make any concessions. We can continue to take over the West Bank and not have to give up any power whatsoever because, look, these are terrorists. How can you negotiate with terrorists, right? And so that was the attitude of, I would say, most, especially on the right side in Israel, that was the attitude among most political leaders. And there's a 2019 interview where I can't recall if this was leaked or not, or whether he stated this publicly, but Bibi Netanyahu says, if you reject the establishment of a Palestinian state, it is incumbent upon you to support Hamas in Gaza. He says it directly. There's no debate about it. And of course, the reason is obvious. This, as long as Palestinians are divided, we don't have to negotiate with them. We don't have to make any concessions. And of course, this is why I think, in part of the reason why the Israeli public is enraged at Netanyahu, and 80% of the Israeli public now thinks he needs to be removed from power because of his policy of supporting Hamas for the past 10 years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zachary Foster, for such an informative and comprehensive and richly factual presentation and teaching on the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is the third of a four-part series on Palestine that the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is hosting. The final teach-in will be on Friday, December 8th, at 12 noon Eastern Time. And you can subscribe to it by going to csrr.rutgers.edu. And that last teaching will focus on Israeli settlements in the occupied territory. For those who missed our previous teachings, you can go to our YouTube channel for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which again is available on our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. And finally, I will just leave you with a note of hope, notwithstanding that there are thousands of Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza, and notwithstanding that the US government and the elected officials seem not to have any care about the value of those lives, what we are seeing among the grassroots, among the people, the members of the public in the United States, is an awareness that has never existed, an unprecedented level of hunger and thirst for the facts that include the experiences and perspectives of Palestinians, not just the perspective of Israelis or sometimes the outright propaganda of the Israeli government. And so we appreciate whatever support you can give the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, ideally financially, by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press donate so that we can continue to engage in public education, research, and advocacy that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation.